One thing for childhood cancer survivors, they often really weren't told when they were young that they could have a problem with fertility, and their parents may feel kind of iffy about how to tell them, and so sometime in their adolescence or their young adulthood, all of a sudden this issue comes up, and it may be unexpected for them. So, and then cause a lot of bitterness and concerns about, will anyone want to marry me if I can't have children, and a lot of concerns like that. For young adults with cancer, who are an even bigger group, because pediatric patients are maybe 1% of cancer survivors, and like teens to young adults are another 6%. Some of them had had a chance to already have one child, and you might think, oh, well, then they're going to feel less sad than someone who never had children. But if they had definitely wanted another child, our surveys that we've done show that their distress is as high as someone who was childless. But what we find is that if people never had a child at the time of their diagnosis, about 3/4 of them will say that they would like to have a child in the future. And so it's not just something that they shrug off and say, oh, I'm glad to be alive, and so my fertility is no big deal. It's a very big deal. Whatever we can do to try to preserve fertility, whether that's storing and freezing sperm for men, or storing and freezing ovarian tissue and eggs for women, or having a young woman go through an IVF cycle and actually freeze some embryos she could use later, those have to be done before they start treatment. And so there's, as you said, this narrow window of time and this very confusing emotional time when you have to make these decisions. Sometimes, yes, especially for teenagers, they'll say, oh, forget about it. Especially boys, maybe more than girls. I'm not that worried about it. But then later on, when they do meet someone and get in a relationship, it becomes a much bigger deal than they thought. Most people don't have insurance that covers these procedures, and for the girls especially, or young women, they're very expensive and very iffy about whether they're going to work. And so that makes the whole thing even worse. And another thing that cancer patients often get is, oh, don't worry, you can always adopt. Well, it's not so easy to adopt as a cancer survivor. There's a whole if people are interested, there's a whole discussion board that's very excellent on yahoo.com called Adoption After Cancer. And people are always writing in and asking things like, how can I find a sympathetic social worker to do a home study? Which countries for international adoption will allow a cancer survivor to adopt? And domestic adoptions, some people manage to do them, but when the birth mother is choosing the couple, a lot of people are very scared about cancer, and a woman might have had a very early stage breast cancer and have, what we think is probably a pretty normal life expectancy, but a birth mother might not choose her because of that. And so the question of how open to be, and and what is in the best interest of the child, are all big issues. And adoption is very expensive unless you adopt a special needs child. And, if a young couple's already dealing with one chronic illness, do they have the financial and emotional resources to adopt an older child who may have been abused or have chronic health problems? Well, I think it's easier if the infertility is known before the relationship starts, and then the cancer history and the fertility history get discussed somewhere in the early but caring part of the dating, so that it's a part of the relationship and a part of the expectations. Where I've seen more relationships break up is, if they were engaged or maybe very newly married, and the cancer all of a sudden comes up and is like, something totally unexpected. And then the infertility, especially in a dating, non-committed relationship, often seems to break things up. Oh, one issue that is an issue for some people is whether to use what I call third-party reproduction, which means having someone other than the couple involved. That might mean using an egg donated from a family member, a friend, or a stranger. It might be using donor sperm, or it might mean using a gestational carrier, a woman who carries the pregnancy either with her own egg or carrying an embryo that belongs genetically to the couple. And that adds a lot of complications. Some people are not comfortable from a religious standpoint. It adds a lot of cost. And unless it's a family member, actually, luckily, men are very lucky in the sense that having a child with donor sperm is relatively cheap, especially if the woman is good, has good fertility, and is under age 35. 3 to 6 cycles, maybe at most $500 a cycle, and chances are she's going to be pregnant. But the options for women, we're talking about $10,000, $20,000, and that's like adoption. It's something that should be covered by insurance. As far as I'm concerned, it's an illness-related problem, and a few insurers are starting to cover it if you've had cancer, but not many. And just the emotional issue of, are you going to be able to love that child? And I think for most families it works out really well, but you do have to put some thought into it ahead of time and be ready to accept a child that belongs genetically to one parent perhaps and not the other. And a lot of couples have fears about that. The research shows that as the process progresses, the negative feelings and anxieties tend to disappear for most couples.